Finish up. I'm gonna put up some slides. These are some slides I put together for the paper that we're discussing. But we left off on Wednesday, basically where you all came as a group, came up with 5 key factors that led to the scientific community and the public at large being ready to accept this idea of biological evolution. And we left off, I think only Alyssa was able to share one. So we have some other key features that y'all came up with and want to share. Because I already mentioned this already, but Darwin basically had a very rare privilege of seeing a very revolutionary idea accepted during his lifetime. And it was because things were ready for that. Yeah, Jonathan?
The shift away from the idea that the universe was immutable.
A big shift away from that, to where virtually everybody had accepted that the universe evolved, that the universe was not immutable, it was not perfect, that things were in flux and actually developing, and that the universe as we know it has not always been what it is, or even close to what it is now. Yeah, Chase?
I kind of felt like there was sort of this large conglomerate movement towards rationalism versus stepping away from the supernatural.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you see that predating Darwin by 100 years or more. This move towards naturalistic explanations for phenomena, and a movement away from, like, it's just magic, right? It's just magic. We just don't know. Really, like a hunger for natural explanations. And Isaac Newton saw this coming, as Isaac Newton did a lot of work towards explaining phenomena in naturalistic terms, and he cautioned against this, cautioned against the methodological naturalism, because he saw it as a natural outcome of some of his publications and Ray's publications. And so, yeah, any other key events? Charles?
I have 2 that I think are really key.
Okay.
First of all is the discovery of discovery. Like we're able to discover things, information that we had in the past was wrong, etc. That would be like the new world and all that. And then also, I think one that's underestimated is the discovery of fossils and rock layers. I know if you read I've read this long, boring biography about Gideon Mantle, and it goes into the origins of paleontology, etc. And that was really key to long Earth evolutionary theory. And that really, the confusion of Genesis versus evolution started when they started discovering fossils and rock layers that didn't seem to match Genesis flood.
Yeah, a real drive in geology towards uniformitarian thinking and long ages and an old Earth had really kind of primed even the church to accept biological evolution, because they had already, under the tutelage of really devout Christians that had accepted an old Earth and long geological ages, they had already kind of abandoned the idea of recent creation of the physical world.
I think a lot of scientists want to keep the recent creation of the world, except from what they saw, did not seem to match up with.
Right. So before Darwin, Cuvier is another name that you'll see fairly regularly throughout this class. Cuvier was probably the most popular scientist in Europe. And Cuvier was in charge of the French Museum of Natural History, and Cuvier was a very devout Christian man, and Cuvier had seen overwhelming evidence for long geological ages, and he had suggested that what the fossil record is showing is a series of extreme catastrophic events that actually wiped all living forms off of the earth. And what the Bible describes as Noah's flood was the most recent of all of those major catastrophic events. So, and that had become, basically when you read religious writings that relate to scientific understanding of origins, that had become the dominant view even in most theological circles as well, of the origin of the earth, but then still holding to a young appearance of modern life. Yeah. Any other key events? Yeah, Alyssa.
There's like 2. They're not really events, like ideas. I think.
Okay.
Was the idea of spontaneous generation still like reliable at that point, wasn't it?
No, Pasteur's work in the 1700s had squashed that for most.
So
for
even like
most
the
people.
little bacteria, then they could. Okay,
Yeah.
Never mind. Then I think there's a kind of like a general disillusionment with the church. Like
Yes,
it
absolutely.
It wasn't as big of part of life as it was.
Yeah, there had been several hundred years of religious wars between Protestants and Catholic Church and between different groups of Protestants. And so it actually had led everybody to really try to find ways of explaining morality apart from revealed religion. Ways to explain just truth, all forms of truth, apart from revealed religion. And so the philosophers had already gone. The philosophers had already gone to evolution of everything, but the scientists had not, because there was not strong scientific evidence as they knew it for biological evolution. But the philosophers had already gone there. And then you had Kant, who had already come up with a way of just how do you be moral apart from revealed religion. So that shift had already happened for sure. Any other key ideas or key factors? All of this just to say that there were a number of events that kind of led to this. Darwin, throughout his entire life, as far as we could tell from his earliest writings, was already convinced of biological evolution even before he had any real proof for it. He was already convinced for it. Darwin was never a very religious person, but he enjoyed the benefits of religion, and so when he left medical school and started to study to become like a religious leader, he had done so kind of with the idea of organizing social events. I mean, that was something that really intelligent people that didn't want to study medicine did. I mean, you basically had medicine, law, and to be a religious leader. So those were what the educated and intelligent people did. But yeah, and then when he went on his trip with the beagle, I mean, everything changed. And then at that point, he married somebody really wealthy, so he didn't need a real job and could just do science. Yeah.
So when you said Darwin, like he was already convinced of biology.
Yeah, he was.
Before, so did that weaken his case per se because he didn't have to prove it as much? Or?
No, I mean, he did have to prove it is the thing. Like, he had watched, so his grandfather advocated for biological evolution. Lamarck, 50 plus years before Darwin did, had advocated for biological evolution, but it just wasn't widely accepted. So he was heavily influenced by reading Lamarck and his grandfather's works. He was already convinced in biological evolution, but realized he needed to have an explanation of how it could happen. Yeah, that was satisfactory. Yeah. All right. Okay. One more thing that we need to deal with from chapters 3 and 4, and then we'll transition into this paper that I had you all read. So in the last one, take a little bit, talk with those around you, and I want you to discuss basically what is positivism. What does that mean in science? This idea of positivism, and what is a different or an altered view of how science should operate and why it's successful. So what is positivism, and what's an alternative view of how science ought to work and why science is successful? All right? Go ahead and take, 2 minutes, talk about this with those around you, and then we'll talk about it collectively. 2 minutes, starting now. Talk.
Alright, what's
Positivism. Positivism.
It's not the same thing as realism. It's a philosophical system that holds that every rational, justifiable assertion can be scientifically verified. or is capable of logical natural proof, and therefore rejects metaphysics and theism.
What you can't see.
So basically, every philosophical system, every philosophical idea can be scientifically verified or logically verified. And that's in regards to everything. Yeah, everything, like even the. So basically, there's no God because you can't explain him logically.
All the things that we can't explain logically, it's irrelevant. Doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist. Which is interesting, because where did it come? Where did those ideas come from in the beginning, in the first place? If they don't exist, then why do we even think of them? Anyway. Right, basically everything that's true can be explained rationally, logically. So basically natural. There is no supernatural. Logic, mathematics, science.
30 seconds.
So, what is the alternative view? That is actually
Positivism. What's the contrary?
what is the alternative view? That there does exist, so that science necessarily or logic. I wouldn't say logic, because I think logic can make a good argument for like the supernatural logic and math. But
5 seconds.
with math, science, like pure science, no, you can't. So
All right. Remember, this is a safe place to be wrong. Somebody tell us what positivism is. Yeah, Emma.
Kind of when it's kind of like atheism where there's no God, they think science can prove everything.
Yeah, that's an outcome of positivism for sure. Yeah, is this the methodological naturalism ultimately becomes the dominant paradigm under positivism? Yeah, Josh.
Isn't it like the current theory right now is like the true theory, like
Uh,
what they believe to be?
So that would be an example of realism, which is oftentimes heavily influenced by positivism for sure. Yeah, Alyssa, do you have some thoughts on positivism?
Yeah, from their views.
Okay.
That positivism is, well, two things, I think. Is it like it assumes all current theories are true? Is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, realism does, which is heavily influenced by positivism.
Okay.
Positivism doesn't necessarily assume that all present theories are true.
Okay, and the main thing is that it means that anything that science can't explain or we can observe via scientific discovery isn't true. Like everything should be able to be explained.
Yes, that's
And if
the
it can't
key
be
of positivism.
explained, then it's not.
Yeah, so the thrust of positivism is any truth statement. Any truth statement. Not any true statement, but any truth statement can be demonstrated to be true. Any truth statement can be demonstrated to be true. That's the idea of positivism. Yeah.
Why are you distinguishing between true and truth? Like what?
So a truth statement is a statement trying to describe something absolute, right? Absolute truth. And it may in fact be wrong. So your truth statement may be wrong. It's an attempt to explain absolute truth. And so any truth statement should be able to be demonstrated to be true. Right? So what it prevents, and there's a key there, is it's a truth statement, but it may end up being false. Therefore, I mean, that's okay. It can still be falsifiable. But any truth statement needs to be able to be demonstrated to be true, without a doubt. And so the impacts of positivism is it throws out any truth statement that cannot be verified. So if you can't verify a truth statement, it has no place as any way of explaining absolute truth. And so logic is an acceptable means by which you can prove a truth statement. But ideally, the ideal is that everything can be verified to be true using empirical data. I mean, that's the key of how positivism influences science. And as a result of these positivist thinking, science becomes basically put onto a pedestal as the only mechanism by which you discover truth. Jonathan, did you have something?
No, I was just going to talk about empiric.
Yeah. And so what happens as a result of positivism? Now, positivism on the whole, it's just any truth statement needs to be able to be demonstrated to be true. Okay? Now, so under positivism, you can use logical. If you can prove something logically, it can still be demonstrated to be true. But what happens as a result of positivist thinking is that basically you emphasize empirical evidence for truth statements, and science gets put up as this is the only mechanism by which you can discover absolute truth. That's an outcome of positivism. It isn't necessarily positivism. Okay? Now, what's an alternative to positivism? What's that? Well, realism oftentimes is heavily influenced by positivist thinking, and realism basically says that that whatever our current theory is, that is true. Okay, unless it gets shown to be false. But we'll talk about different flavors of realism and how you deal with that issue of theory change and of actually falsifying theories. But a big alternative to this are Kuhn's ideas. And in the lecture that you all watched in preparation for Wednesday, the positivist analogy is basically science is this really immaculate house built on an incredibly firm foundation. That these truth statements from science are true because they're grounded on empirical evidence, right? And then what do you do if like a theory gets shown wrong? Well, I mean, just something catastrophic happened to that house. But that's that idea. Kuhn's ideas about science and really all inquiries for truth is it's basically just like the present paradigm. You just take like a swamp and you're like, man, I want to build a house right in the middle of the swamp, but I can't just build it on the water, so I put enough solid material in the water to give me something to build on. But you realize that the house is not built on a firm foundation and it's very transitory. And that's kind of Kuhn's understanding of a search for truth, that all searches for truth are kind of built on what do most people think right now. All right? So that's kind of an alternative to positivism. But just kind of the take-home idea of that is that ideas from positivism basically put science up as like this is the only mechanism by which you can discover absolute truth. Anything else is not going to demonstrate to you absolute truth. Yeah, Jordan.
So, would it be safe to say that Kuhn does not believe in absolute truth?
That is a good question. It would be reasonable to assume that from his positions, but I don't know where he actually fit in that. But yeah, I mean, from his positions, you would assume that, but I don't know. Yeah.
So then, like, if the paradigm shifts, does he just, like, everything that he built on that, like, previous paradigm, does that just, like, collapse and he
No, because parts of that original paradigm persist even if you have a revolution, right? Even if you have a revolution, there are parts of the paradigm or some of the predictions that you would make based on that paradigm that will survive that revolution. You know, just like in the same way, like if you have a political revolution, there are some aspects of the former government that end up in the next, right? Yeah, that's a good question. All right. So I know it's weird. Chapters 3 and 4, they're weird, right? The history of science isn't weird. It's just, man, there are a lot of names. And then 4 on the philosophy of science, it's just strange. And then this paper that I picked for y'all to read, it's strange, right? It's philosophy of science stuff. But the paper focuses just on why is science successful? Why has it helped us understand more about the natural world if it is just a man-made way of learning, right? It's just a man-made tool by which we discover the natural world. Why has it been so successful? Why is it that science has helped us to advance all aspects of human society? Yeah.
Science is based off of logic.
It is.
And reality.
Although so is philosophy.
Well,
and yet philosophy has not been nearly as successful in improving quality of life and
There are big
longevity.
reasons for that. Actually, I think very logical reasons for that. But as far as science is concerned, why it is successful is because it's dealing with logic and of things that we can actually directly observe.
Yeah.
Philosophy. See, this is how I think it works. Is basically you have a room inside of a house.
A room inside of a house.
Okay, so God could put us in this room,
Yes.
and an individual can understand a lot from that room.
Yes.
About that room. We conduct experiments, understand the room, we can observe the room, and get to know this room very, very well. But unless he's given access to the rest of the house, he's not going to understand the house. And even though he can make predictions about the house based off of that room, and some of those predictions can be pretty good, some of those may not be so good. But until he's given access to the rest of the house, or is given an insight through a window, a video, something, he's not going to understand the rest of the house. So the Lord has given us this nature that we are in, and in one sense, it's a lot of rooms, and we're finding new doors that we can open through scientific advancement. But
Or maybe just increase the light in the room.
Or
right? So you're
increase the
seeing
light,
more
right.
aspect of the.
right.
Let's keep this analogy good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I like it.
Anyways, but there's still going to be places that we do not have access without the Word of God. And without
Absolutely.
the Word of God, we're not going to understand it. Basically, I think that that logic and reality is integral in God's character, and
Yeah.
therefore, everything He's created, whether it's heaven and earth, is a reflection of His logical and truth that is part of.
Sure.
His character.
Yeah, and that was the idea of the scientists that were involved in the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
That you could understand the nature and character of God because He put aspects of His character and nature in the creation that He made. I like this analogy. You know, think about it this way. What if the only room that we're in is the bathroom, right? And you're trying to make predictions on an entire house based on only seeing the bathroom, right? Gosh, man, I like this analogy a lot. Yeah.
It'd be hard to sleep in that bathroom.
It would be, but there's no time for sleeping anyways. There's so much learning to be done. Yeah. There's so much learning. And then it's like, okay, well, what aspects of the bathroom can we only understand through the Word of God?
Can we quote you on that?
Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Man, I like this.
Out of context.
I like this. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So this paper that I gave for you to read, it was fun. So I read it initially, and I'm like, it actually, believe it or not, it was one of the easiest philosophy of science papers that I had to actually give to you, and it was by far one of the shortest. Okay. That being said, though, philosophy of science questions are just strange. Okay, and so if you want to, I know he gives you, there's a title to his paper, but basically I titled the paper my own way, and it's this way: how do we explain the success of science? How do we explain why science has been so successful in helping us to understand the natural world, if in fact most of our theories end up being wrong, right? Because that's kind of the whole sense of the paper, is that we know from the history of science that most of our theories end up being wrong, and yet science is incredibly successful in giving us a greater and fuller understanding of the natural world. Right? So how do we explain this? So first way, you get the true realists, and this is how they would explain the success of science. So the success of science is due because the theories explain truth. These are truth statements that actually explain absolute truth. So science is so successful because it's based on theories that explain absolute truth. And here's kind of the ideas that lead up to this conclusion. Because we know there is objective truth, and that's one of the assumptions of science, that the world we live in is knowable and it is discoverable, right? There is some absolute truth. If this isn't an assumption that you hold, right, you don't really consider what science is doing successful, right? Unless you could define success in some other way. But this is an assumption of science, that there is objective truth, and the truth is knowable. Okay, another assumption of science, there is objective truth, and that truth is knowable, it's discoverable. However, it's discoverable using material explanations and empirical data, so we can explain natural phenomena by natural processes and current processes. These again are further assumptions of science. So because all of these are true, because we know there's objective truth and that truth is knowable using material explanations and empirical data, then scientific theories then are explaining absolute truth. There is absolute truth, it's knowable, and it's knowable using material explanations and empirical data, which is what science is grounded on. Therefore, science is explaining absolute truth. And that's why science is so successful, because there is absolute truth, and science is uniquely equipped to discover and explain that absolute truth. And so that's the way a realist would describe why science is so successful. Do you have any questions for the realist, a true realist? Yeah, Alyssa.
Why are they called realists if generally realist means like pessimistically realistic? Why is it more optimistically realistic?
Because you're bringing a different understanding of realism into this inquiry. So this is scientific realist. It's not just... What's that?
Why are they called realists?
Why are they called realists? Because it's the idea that what our present theories are a accurate representation of reality. All right? Do you have any other questions for a realist? Yeah.
I guess this is kind of devil's advocate, but I think people would disagree with this because of assumptions maybe that they're making. Like people would say that they're assuming that there's like absolute objective truth.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, so what if your assumptions are wrong?
Right.
Yeah, which is a wonderful question for a realist, but one that we're not equipped to handle. So it is a wonderful question, but we won't address that one. I'm not equipped to handle that. At least not right now. My brain's not working great today, so yeah.
A question I would ask a realist would be, how do you know for sure that your ideas that you're arriving at based off your material explanations and empirical data are true? Because you can have numbers and data in front of you but interpret it incorrectly.
Right. It's just because it's a material explanation doesn't mean that it isn't it isn't dependent upon your interpretation of those data, right? So how do you know your interpretations are true? So that's fine. You can assume that there is absolute truth and it's knowable and you have these data describing that, but how do you know your interpretation of those data are right? Especially given the fact that theories change through time. And if these theories are explaining absolute truth, why do they change so much? Is another wonderful question to ask a true realist, right? So, because a true realist would say the reason science is so successful is because theories are true. There are truth statements that have been verified as true, which is interesting because all you need is one example of it being wrong and it has now been falsified. So now it is a truth statement that is not true. And then so how can that still explain the success of that truth statement?
So do true realists actually exist? Because it seems like the easiest argument to defeat.
I don't know. That's a wonderful question. I don't know. I don't know of any present philosophers of science that are true realists.
It's kind of funny in these philosophy papers they address philosophies that seem like so silly, and it's like, why do people actually believe this? And you'd have to be kind of, it'd be silly to believe this kind of thing, but we still are arguing about it. No, seriously.
Yeah.
Wait, isn't there a difference between people who think that the best way to go about science is to assume that all of them are right, all the theories are right, even if they aren't? Just because
Correct. I mean, that's what any scientist should do, right? Unless you're a maverick, right? And you're challenging the paradigm. But I mean, the whole idea of science is that you assume that the theories are true, and they become then your observations of your own inquiries. So even if you're testing a currently held theory, you still assume that it's true, make predictions based on the fact that it is true, and then if those predictions are false, then now it starts to call the theory into question. But yeah, every scientist should assume that the theories are true.
So isn't it the difference between the only way to do science is assume they're true versus saying that all of them are obviously true?
Yes, but we're trying to explain not how do you do science, but why is science so successful, right? So your argument then that you're trying to make is science is successful because everybody believes the theories to be true, which is a different explanation for the success of science than because the theories are actually true. Anyways, all right, so Kuhn's ideas. So Kuhn's ideas is basically, it's all about the paradigm. So an agreed upon paradigm is anything that the conformers all agree to be true, and then that these paradigms are going to demonstrate the legitimate problems that there are. Okay, so the dominant paradigm adopted by most of the thinkers, the conformers, demonstrates what are the legitimate problems and then also demonstrates what are potential solutions to these legitimate problems. So Kuhn would argue against science being successful because the theories are true, because Kuhn pointed out two big things. One is that theories are replaced with other theories. And two, even if the theories are true, that still doesn't explain why it actually why you can accumulate more and more and more knowledge, more and more and more understanding just by having a current truth statement in place, right? So you can say that the earth revolves around the sun, and that may be true, but it doesn't necessarily help you to understand anything more about the earth in that you adopt that truth statement. And so Kuhn would rather say that science is successful because you have a group of scientists, conformers, that continue to make progress because this paradigm predicts legitimate problems and potential solutions to it. So that the current paradigm gives you additional questions to ask and makes predictions on what the answers to those questions will be. And this is the reason science is successful, or you get a new paradigm replacing the old and then establishing new criteria for success. And so this is Kuhn's idea. His idea is it has nothing to do with whether or not the theory is true. In fact, every single scientific theory you can have could be wrong, and yet science could still be successful. And this is interesting because you have to remember most of Europe believed Aristotle's idea of the universe and biological life. That the universe was immutable, that biological life was immutable, was unchanging, and that was wrong, and yet it drove people to actually ask further questions and predict answers to those questions. And so science can be successful even if every single theory is wrong. Yeah. Do you have any questions for Kuhn? Yeah, Alyssa.
So it's not based off its relation to truth, it's based off its relation to understanding?
Yeah, it's based on its relationship to your acceptance of it as truth. This is kind of your idea, or at least what I got from your sense of the question that you were asking, right? Where you said, in order to do science, don't you have to assume the theory to be true? And this is kind of Kuhn's idea, that science is successful because people assume this is true, and it drives them to ask further questions and predict the answers to those questions. So science is successful entirely because people assume that those theories are true. It has nothing to do with whether or not they're actually true. It's because people assume them to be true. Yeah.
I would ask how, when new paradigms come about, I feel like they kind of build off of the old paradigm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Potentially. So if you could say that you're getting closer to the truth,
Right.
you have to assume that they're wrong all the time.
So you might ask him, why do some aspects of the old paradigm persist?
Yeah.
Right? Is it because otherwise it's basically under Kuhn's idea, you have no way to explain why do some parts of a paradigm persist through that scientific revolution, through that understanding. Josh?
Is Kuhn's ideas like largely practiced still? I realized that the paper was like written in 2012, but
Yes, so Kuhn's ideas dominate a lot of the philosophy of science. Now, you do get some what you would call new realist, but Kuhn's ideas of science dominate a lot of the philosophy of science. Yeah. Yeah, this is an essay written by a grad student, basically exploring his own research as trying to advocate a different form of realism. Yes, Steph?
Kuhn in the paper said that the shifts between paradigms often involve radical ontological discontinuity. What does that mean exactly?
So, ontological is a development of thinking, or it could be just any kind of development. So, like the ontology of an organism is how it develops, and so ontological discontinuity is a completely different change in the way you think. It's not a natural progression. And so that's the idea of you're continuing to operate under the old paradigm. You're asking new and new questions all the time and predicting answers to those. But in order to have a paradigm shift, you need ontological discontinuity. You need a completely different way of thinking. It's not a natural progression of the current paradigm. It's something completely different.
So it would have to be on a radical level in order for
Yes, it would have to question the paradigm itself rather than assuming the paradigm to be true. And so, yeah, it's a completely different way of thinking. Instead of assuming the paradigm is true and therefore asking new questions, you assume that you no longer assume the paradigm to be true and you question the paradigm itself. Yeah. That's a good question. All right. So here are the new versions of realism. First one, revisionary ontological realism. And again, this word ontological. Okay? This development of thinking. And this is kind of fun. So Kuhn's big problem with realism was what? What did Kuhn point out as the problems of realism? Because remember, realism says the reason science is successful is because its theories are true. Well, go.
He just doesn't think that things can be actually true if they're.
Yeah, well, that's one. He's not a positivist, so he obviously does not assume that you could ever prove a theory to be true. Rather, you could show that alternative theories are wrong. But yeah, Kuhn also believes that you cannot possibly prove a theory to be true. And so the example Kuhn gives, and this is something I talked about in the video you watched in preparation for Wednesday, you could say that crows are black, right? And you could survey 400 million crows and they're all black. All it takes is for you to find one white crow, and now that is not a truth statement. Crows are not black, at least not always, right? And so Kuhn, yeah, he's an anti-positivist for sure, and so he would say that you cannot prove a theory to be true for sure. And he's got another big problem with realism. Yeah.
The history of science shows that a lot of the theories were wrong.
Yeah, theories get replaced. So if they are true statements, why are they replaced all the time? So obviously that these theories are not true statements about truth. They may be truth statements, but they're not always true statements about truth. Okay? Next week we'll get far more tangible, okay? Next week it'll be like, here's two different ways of interpreting the fossil record, right? It'll be less like just inside of your head imagining things, right? If you're like, wow, this class is really terrible. I mean, you may feel that way the whole time, but I can't promise you that you won't feel that, but it will get different. So these type of realists say that the only things that are actually theories are those that actually make novel predictions. Okay? The only statements of truth that are actually theories are those that make new predictions. So that way it throws out a lot of things that would be held as theories that don't fit that category. And then so it's like, okay, well, we actually haven't had all that many theories replaced. Okay? Because the only things that are truly theories are those that make novel predictions, new predictions. And also that not a revisionary ontological realist would say not every statement of the truth statement has to be true, just some of it, and it's still true, right? If something in the statement is true, then it still is a true statement about truth. Okay? It's fun, right? Yeah.
So wait, are these like coming after Kuhn's ideas?
Yes,
Like,
these are in response to
realism?
Kuhn's challenges of realism.
Okay, and then
And they say, you're right, there are a lot of theory change, unless most of those weren't actually theories because they didn't predict any new truth. Then you actually aren't replacing a lot of theories. And if the theories had anything right about them, then they were still true statements about that objective truth. Even if most of it got replaced, if some of it remained, then it was still a true statement about truth. Yeah, Jordan.
So when did our modern definition of a theory like actually come into?
Yeah, it's a good question. Probably with Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon in the 1700s. Yeah, and philosophers then. Yeah. And it may predate that, but that's probably where you get the modern thinking of what is a theory. That's a good question. All right, then you have structural realism. And this, again, follows the revisionary ontological realism that some aspect of the true statement must be true. And the way that we know this is it's preserved. So theirs is all about the preservation of certain aspects of those truth statements. That in your new theories, something was brought back before and is restated, reaffirmed, rewritten in your new truth statements. Yeah.
So wait, how is that different from the last part of revisionary ontological realism?
So it's because it's all about the preservation, that the preservation of those ideas. That it's not enough just to say that there were some aspects of it that weren't wrong, but they actually had to be good enough predictors that they actually persisted into future theories. Yeah. And this is kind of fun. Let's do this. Take about a minute and discuss this question with those around you. What does saying that theories get replaced by new theories assume about your current theories? Okay? So why do you assume, what do you have to assume in order to believe that previous theories were wrong? Okay? What do you have to assume in order to believe that previous theories were wrong? Take about a minute, talk about it with those around you, and then we'll point it out.
You're assuming that your theories are at least partially correct. Yeah.
Maybe you interpret the data.
Yeah. So dumb. So if you think that, yeah, so if you
If you have all
Your new idea is right.
you never have all
It's
that.
different from what you have to have.
yeah, so the preservation
You're
of
constantly asking
by saying
questions.
that like the previous theories right still had like certain aspects that
You know,
were
like
right.
given time,
And this
you're
new theory, but that's not
you're given proven theory and then also
so basically
so it's just another.
Yeah, so in order to assume that your previous theories were wrong, what do you have to assume about your current theories?
At one point can you say this theory is true beyond shadow of data?
All right. Yeah, Steph. Did you have a question or did you have an answer?
I wanted it.
Yeah, what do you got for us?
What we have to assume is that it's highly probable that our most current and successful theories are false at this point. Like,
Or well, in order for them to have replaced previous theories, you actually have to assume that your present theories are true.
are true.
Yeah, and therefore replaced your false theories.
Wait, repeat that.
Yeah, so if you assume that your previous theory was false, then you have to assume that the theory that replaced it is true, and therefore demonstrated that your previous theory was false. And so this is a common objection by a realist to this whole problem of theory change. Is like, well, maybe we were wrong in changing the theory in the first place, right? How do we know that the original theory was wrong and this present theory is true? Yeah.
But you can really definitively show that a theory is wrong. It's not so easy to determine
That's
if the theory
true.
is right. So we can
Yeah.
for sure say this was wrong.
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily mean that our current theory is right. It just means we found something wrong with the old one.
Right, except for in examples where you didn't actually show the old theory to be wrong, but you just replaced it with a new theory.
But generally, the reason why we need a new theory is because the old one had some problems with it. It wasn't
Yeah, actually, what you find is usually the reason we change theories is because there are particularly charismatic mavericks that popularize their new theories. Most scientific revolutions don't happen necessarily, at least at the beginning, as a result of showing the dominant theory to be wrong, but rather popularize a new idea that then maybe later on shows that the old idea was wrong. And this we'll see a lot with when we look at, okay, here's the fossil record, what are two different ways to interpret that? And which way is considered to be true? And it's not because the other one was shown to be wrong. It's because there are either particularly charismatic people advocating for one, or the other one makes you feel better about other assumptions that you have.
Didn't you say that you don't think archaeology is
It's certainly not a hard science. You can do scientific archaeological work, but it requires you to actually test hypotheses. So if you're testing hypotheses, and that's why if you read, an archaeological paper, coupled with their observations, they'll they'll test some hypotheses. So if they find some object and they predict that it's, an object of war, that they'll do some, work with it to see could it actually be used as an object of war, right? Same thing with paleontology. So Dr. McLean is a paleontologist, and he had a T-Rex bone with bite marks on it, and that's just their observations, and then their prediction was that it was a result of a T-Rex feeding on another T-Rex. So then they fed bones to crocodilians and other animals, and to see what does it look like when you're tearing flesh off of a bone versus if you're just fighting. And their prediction of that the T-Rex was eating another one was supported by their evidence. And so, why are you getting into this? Are you upset about that I said archaeology is not a hard science?
No, I was thinking that your reasons, what was the thing that you're saying didn't seem to make sense.
Yeah, in order to be science, you have to work through the scientific method. You can't just stop after observation. Yeah. Okay, so the best current theory, this is the theory of the author of the paper. And so basically he says that the success of any theory can be explained by that people believe it to be true, kind of an idea of Kuhn. But theories can be completely false and entirely replaced and still have been successful because they were believed to be true. Not because they were just adopted by most of the scientists, but specifically because they were believed to be true. Specifically because they were believed to be true. So he differentiates this from Kuhn's ideas in that it's still attached to the idea of truth. It's not just a matter of because most of the people adopted this or operated under this, but because people actually believed it was objective truth. That is, it was representation of objective truth. It's not just an idea of conformity. But it's attached to truth. That it's not enough just for people to believe or to operate under that paradigm, but they actually have to believe that that paradigm is true. This is best current theory. So it's not entirely different from Kuhn's ideas, but it's just you have to, because Kuhn's ideas basically leave you with this. they leave you with the ability to test or to understand what theories kind of win out, right? They help you to understand what theories win out because you can see what theories are adopted by most people, or what do most people operate under, what paradigm do they operate under. But it doesn't explain why the theory is actually successful. And the only way to explain why it's successful is because the people that operate under it actually believe it to be true. Okay? All right? That's it. We're out of time, and we're done with the philosophy of science. We will never again talk about the philosophy of science. I mean, not in this detail. Or anywhere close to it. All right?